Right now, I'm going to introduce our editor-in-chief, Lois Jones, from the Journal of Ethics in Publishing. She is director of peer review at the American Psychological Association. She's also one of our faculty, and she's a graduate of our publishing program and a good friend and neighbor. Just recently moved to Tacoma Park. So she's going to introduce our next panel.
Thank you. I will say I specifically moved to Tacoma Park, Silver Spring area just so John and I could hang out. It was the actual goal. I didn't actually know until I moved there, and then it turned out everyone I know is like 15 minutes away from me, which is weird. But yes, thank you. So again, as everybody has said, thank you, John and Pooja, for putting this together. It's fantastic. The topics have been wonderful. Like John said, I work in peer review, and I've worked in peer review for like 10 or 11 years. You lose count at a certain point. But what I love is I have all this experience in it, and I, just got new opinions I hadn't even heard of, or hadn't thought too deeply in. So John, in addition to introducing our next two speakers, asked me to just talk a tiny bit about the journal. So yes, the GW, Journal of Ethics in Publishing, we just published our second volume. We're hoping to publish the third volume, issue 1, in March. So we have peer review going for that. I know some of you, the names I've seen for attendees, you have submissions with us. I thank you. You will be getting decision letters soon. Anybody else presenting or in the room, if you have something you're talking about and you think I'm not expert enough, or I haven't been in the field long enough, please think about it, because the fact you're here, you're thinking about it, you're talking about it, that means that you have an opinion worth putting out there. And so I want to really invite everybody to participate. And if you're like, I don't really want to write something, but I have definite opinions, please also email or sign up to be a reviewer, because we want as many reviewers as possible. And so now I will introduce our speakers. I think, are you going at the same time or separately? Separately? Okay, sorry, I think I had asked that. So Maliea Ruby is the first one. She is a recent grad of Portland State University with an MS in book publishing. As part of that, she worked as a project manager on a YA fantasy novel, which I think is just everybody's goal when they get into publishing, because that's like the really fun, interesting thing. Through this program, she found a love for both editing and marketing. And then our second speaker for this part will be Sophia Zengierski. And excuse me, she's a writer and an editor based in New Jersey. Her career in textbook publishing has actually included sales, marketing, and editorial. She has degrees in both literature and nonprofit leadership, so that's pretty impressive.
Great, thank you. You want to get the slides up? So one of Pooja and my goals for this conference when we rebooted it was to get student presentation, recent students, recent graduates, and not only from our program, but from other programs. So we're really glad to have somebody from Portland State, which is a great program. And also Sophia is also a recent master's graduate.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. So before I get started, I'm just going to do a quick run through of what I'll be going over. I'm going to start with my research question that I developed from my thesis, a few definitions in case not everybody is familiar with legal jargon. I'm going to establish some background information to help provide understanding for later analysis, where I'll go through my case study of some major court cases and the modern day precedent that they established, and some proposed solutions and recommendations I have for authors. So the question that I created and pursued was, what is the purpose of the satisfaction clause in publishing, how it's been controversial since the 1970s, and what is or should be the future of this clause in publishing contracts for publishers. So now the satisfaction clause is defined as a provision in a contract that makes one party's performance conditional on the satisfaction of the other party. And good faith is considered to be honesty in a person's conduct during the contractual agreement. It's an obligation that exists in all contracts. And I'm going to establish a general example of the clause. I'm using this one from Simon & Schuster that states, the publisher shall not be obligated to accept or publish the literary work if in its sole editorial judgment, such work is not satisfactory to it. So in general, the satisfaction clause is used in many industries, such as most manual labors like construction and most freelance positions. It gives the party seeking a job done to use their own standards to determine whether the work meets the contract's requirements. But this leads to a kind of power imbalance. And since this is contract law, there's more to this clause than what it says. The concept of good faith was brought about in the early 20th century and further developed decades later. At the time, buyers couldn't give a capricious or arbitrary reason for invoking the clause, and its use spread further with its inclusion in the Uniform Commercial Code. It's a set of laws that govern commercial transactions in the US. So good faith occurs when the party that passes judgment exercises its discretion for any reason within the justifiable expectations of the parties arising from their agreement. Keyword here being reason, why a party finds a work unsatisfactory instead of the actions taken. And lastly, what it might be called bad faith is when these reasons are outside the justifiable expectations. What these expectations are vary contract to contract based on how the clauses are worded, and whether it's justified is for a court to decide. Whoops, too far. Wrong side. In the context of publishing contracts, the clause is always included because it provides a lot of protections for publishers. For example, it gives them the power to determine what's satisfactory because it helps them avoid lawsuits for a manuscript's content. But since they write the contract, it's stacked in their favor. Authors without literary agents to represent them or any real negotiating strength are left with kind of very little power over the development of their work as it goes through the publishing process. This has resulted in a fairly unfavorable opinion of this clause. But what they do have is considered a refundable advance and little latitude on paper, while publishers have near total discretion over a manuscript's acceptability. So the good faith obligation evens the power balance a little by requiring the publisher to display a commitment by making explicit efforts to assist the author. This often presents as editorial work, but a court may still favor the publisher because of the financial risk that they take with manuscripts. It's determined on a case-by-case basis due to the uniqueness of each manuscript and the wording of these contracts. So story time. In 1996, Joan Collins, a famous British actress, signed a $4 million contract with Random House for the publication of 2 manuscripts. Her agent, Irving Lazar, was able to negotiate the satisfaction clause down to just stating completes rather than something like the Simon & Schuster example at the bottom. So when she delivered a very substandard manuscript after being paid $1.2 million, Random House invoked the contract and they ended up in court. But because of this negotiated wording of this clause, the court found in favor of Collins and was able to keep the $1.2 million. So these are some of the concepts that I will be considering in my analysis of the following cases. So first up is Random House versus Gold. I'm going to start by laying out some of the basic facts of the case before going into the story of it. It took place in November 1978 in the Southern District of New York. The plaintiff, Random House, sought to recover advances paid to defendant Herbert Gold, an author that has published with Random House prior to this. Gold counterclaimed, alleging breach of contract in bad faith. In 1970, Gold signs with Random House to publish 4 works with a total advance of $150,000 paid in 10 installments. The first 2 are published, and then in January 1973, Gold had received $60,000 of his total advance. At the end of July, his agent, James Brown, submitted the 3rd manuscript, where the editor-in-chief, James Silberman, read it and handed it to fiction editor Joe Fox to read as well. And upon request, Silberman learned that the payments amounted to about $71,500. That's including royalties as of March. In August, Fox reported negative critiques to Silberman and asked whether Random House was behind financially on this contract. So in September, Silberman passed some of the comments on to Gold for revisions. And in December, Silberman wrote to Brown that the contract was going to be terminated per satisfaction clause. And he testified that he did read the revised manuscript before choosing to reject and was conscious of the financial circumstances, but didn't give it to another editor to read. So in January 1974, Silberman offered to renegotiate, but this did not happen. And after the rejection, Brown, the literary agent, offered the manuscript to McGraw-Hill, and they paid Gold $10,000, which is the action that brought about the lawsuit. So back to court. Random House sought to recover $50,000 of unearned advance, which Gold agreed to pay if the contract were to be terminated. But Gold also retaliated by saying he was entitled to the agreed upon advance and another $15,000 for the first two published manuscripts. Now, the judge had to determine whether Random House breached the contract, whether Gold had to repay his advance, and whether Random House is liable for the remaining payments. Gold argued Random House gave improper weight to the finances upon rejecting him. This was found to be unestablished because he couldn't prove why. He couldn't provide evidence that clearly showed these reasons. The judge also found that Random House was not liable for breach of contract regarding books 3 and 4, but couldn't recover any payments for the first two books as they had already been published. Overall, the outcome was found in favor of Random House, but the financials came out to Random House paying Gold $15,000. So to look more closely, I'll start with what exactly the clause said. The manuscript had to be in content and form satisfactory to the publisher. This is very standard. The judge's findings established a decades-long precedent that authors have the burden of proof and financial reasons are valid to reject a manuscript. Random House did have the burden of proof here in this case, but since Gold's claims weren't established by a preponderance of the credible evidence. As for the financial aspect, scholar Mark Fowler states it best in this case that it conflicts with this basic tenet of contract law. It is heretical and thoroughly unpersuasive. This tenet being that a buyer can't break a contract and escape liability just because they become unhappy with the bargain finances and not the work performed. Barring a clause specifically stating otherwise, finance-based rejection was only valid if the contract was make or break for the company's finances. Overall, this case seemed to have stripped most protections an author had from a publisher breaching contract in bad faith. On to the next case. Harcourt Brace Jovanovich, I believe, I'm going to call HBJ versus Goldwater. It was February 1982, also in New York. HBJ sued for breach of contract and sought recovery of payments made to Barry Goldwater and Stephen Shadig. Shadig is an author that had previously written with HBJ, and Barry Goldwater was the subject of this manuscript. The advances amounted to $200,000 with $65,000 to be paid at the time of signing. And note, this timeline is very long and dramatic, so I'm going to be skipping most of it and only talk about the most prevalent events. So the contract was signed in January 1977 after Shadig and his agent, Oscar Collier, submitted a proposal. There was some communication between the editor Hill and Goldwater in February showing that he welcomed any editing. This was in a letter, I believe. In June, Shadig sent a 7-chapter draft. After this, there's no communication from Hill. Shadig testified he placed a phone call to Hill that went unreturned. September, Hill gave negative feedback to Collier, and she testified that she was requested by Collier to refrain from direct contact with the authors due to her opinions, which Collier denied. Evidence showed Hill did no editing on these chapters, indicating that she was considering replacing Shadig with another author, going as far as contacting another author's agent. Her only direct contact with the authors showed only support for the project. A letter from that November sent by Hill to Collier's daughter, Lisa, implied her comments had been passed on and work was progressing. Meanwhile, the authors continue to write, but without any editorial comments. Shadegg requests some from Collier, who does provide some suggestions, but the court determines that they were not a substitute of work from the publisher. So July 1978, another 24 chapters were sent to Hill by Goldwater. Still no communication. Hill testified her concern as to how the books could be marketed and sought advice of 2 other editors who also had critiques. This all ends with the manuscript being bought by another, edited as normal, and became a bestseller in the fall of 1979. At the end of the case, the judge did find in favor of the authors, stating that HBJ breached contract by willfully failing to engage in any rudimentary work or effort. Also, that HBJ couldn't simply rely on the opinion that the manuscript was unsatisfactory. So the main piece of the satisfaction clause in this case stated that the manuscript had to be satisfactory to the publisher in form and content. But since HBJ couldn't rely on just their own opinion of satisfaction, there had to be another implied obligation. And this was the obligation to engage in appropriate editorial work with the author, which consists of a reasonable degree of communication. This includes specifics of what the publisher wants, what they are really looking for. Without editorial help, the author can't perform properly under the contract. But due to the lack of work in this case, the judge couldn't quantify the editorial work required. This was a large step in further defining what was considered good faith in publishing contracts, and every similar case that took place after this opinion included the publisher's obligation to provide editorial support. So last case is Dell Publishing v. Whedon. This one was in 1983, also in New York, where Dell sued author Julia Whedon for breach of contract and sought recovery of advances totaling $14,000. Dell and her agent signed her contract in May 1974 and was to receive $20,000. Whedon met the editor Amburn and worked until 1977 with limited contact. When she submitted the first half of the manuscript, Amburn was enthusiastic and made no suggestions for revisions. So Whedon continued her work and submitted the rest in February 1978. She later had one phone call with Amburn, who expressed some hesitations, but never gave any revisions. In March, Amburn told Whedon they wouldn't be publishing the manuscript, canceled the contract, and returned the manuscript. A month later, Doubleday, Dell's parent company, accepted the book and signed a contract with Whedon. It's published in 1981 when Dell then filed the lawsuit that Whedon failed to deliver a satisfactory manuscript. There was a one-day trial that used expert testimony to establish the facts. The conflict centered around what the legal obligations that each party had in the contract. And as the manuscript was subject to Dell's satisfaction in form, style, and content, the main issue was whether Dell had the good faith obligation to allow Whedon to revise with editorial help to bring it up to their standards. Based on testimony, the court determined Dell owed Whedon a detailed explication of the problems it saw and an opportunity to revise, and that Dell had breached contract by failing to provide editorial services. So Whedon retained her advance and the complaint was dismissed. So in this case, Dell's argument follows the logic of Gold, but with the determination of the obligation to edit, the court followed the logic of the previous case, Harcourt. Whether Dell was obligated to let Whedon revise, the judge found there was never any suggestion that a change was necessary or even desirable, because she completed the novel before they ended up rejecting her. This case established the precedent that authors are owed more concrete and specific obligations in certain key areas of the satisfaction clause. Overall, it changed the industry standard practice. It was even obvious to the public when New York Times reported that it showed publishers within the same corporate structure act independently. So this brings us to the modern day. Even though it was 40 years ago, well before I was born, the law is incredibly slow to adapt to societal changes. In 2002, author John Nance claimed Random House breached their contract alleging bad faith and fraud, but he failed to provide proof. Random House didn't break the contract because the clause said, should publisher find the revised work unacceptable for any reason, publisher may reject it. So in here, the burden of proof still fell to the author. In 2003, the definition of good faith updated to include the observance of reasonable commercial standards of fair dealing, in addition to factual honesty. It shifted scholars' focus to the idea of reasonable expectations. Scholar Feynman in 2014 explains, to protect reasonable expectations, a court will start with what each party specifically stated in a contract, put them in the context of how the contract came about, and apply industry standards to determine liability. It's kind of looking at the contract through a lens of norms to determine what's reasonable. He also states that reasonable expectations are made up of an agreed common purpose to publish a manuscript and justified expectations, which must come from a source broader than the purpose. This source being standards of decency and fairness. Contracts aren't made in a vacuum, so these ideas are present and always relevant. Feynman concluded that the core of good faith is keeping consistent with justified expectations, and that observing reasonable commercial standards requires contextual understanding of the contract. Courts continue to struggle to define good faith, but authors are gaining more protections because of it. If publishers operate outside these expectations, they're much less likely to bring about a satisfaction-related case to court. So as we look forward to the ever-changing publishing landscape, there's a possibility for change. Out of the many proposed solutions I found in my research, I identified 4 that I felt have the most potential to give authors more protections and ensure that they still get paid even if their work is ultimately canceled. So first is from a roundtable discussion in 1990 brought by literary agent Arnold Goodman. It's a strategy he uses in negotiation that he found most publishers will accept. They will agree to limit rejection to reasons of editorial insufficiency, ruling out what is not the fault of the author. So if an editor leaves the company, if the company stops publishing, things of that nature they'll still get paid. So the second was brought by Calvin House in 1984 that includes an idea similar to a kill fee. These are often used with freelancers for one-time publication. So if the manuscript is rejected for something other than dissatisfaction, an author will still be paid an amount agreed upon at signing. Third was brought by Fowler. This one doesn't actually change the clause, but rather adds to it. He suggests adding the proposal and/or a sample chapter that would set the publisher's expectations of the final product. This will prevent rejection for not being what was expected and helps the courts to determine the publisher's mindset at signing. And finally, the Authors Guild proposed an entire rewrite in 1980. And while I didn't find the whole thing to be feasible, there is a part that I believe has some merit. An author would retain a certain percentage of the total advance, so they're compensated if rejected. How this percentage is calculated is very long and detailed, and so I will not get into it at this time. Other legal scholars like Robert Stein have expressed similar opinions, though he believes publishers would insist on adding, given the size of the advance to which publisher is committed hereunder, because while the manuscript may be publishable, the size of the advance may change that in the eyes of the publisher. Of these 4, I am personally partial to the second and third to be the most promising because they find a kind of middle ground between publishers, authors, and their literary agents. The satisfaction clause is very necessary for publishers, but they have an ethical duty to be fair and transparent to writers who put so much effort into their craft. They should remain aware of the power they hold over authors and act accordingly. So if there are any authors here today, I have 3 recommendations. If at all possible, get yourself an agent. They'll do all the negotiations for you and they'll have your best interests in mind. If you do it yourself, do your research on contracts, look up legal jargon and negotiation tactics. And third, you can hire a contract lawyer to temporarily represent you. They can look over your contract, they can give you advice and knowledge on how to move forward. Or if you don't want to do any other further reading, I have a very long bibliography that you can scroll through. So thank you all for listening to my presentation. I hope you found something.
Okay, hi. I'm Sophia, and like Lois said, I've been in all over the place. I've been in sales, marketing, editorial, a whole bunch of places, and this is research that I completed while at the University of Pennsylvania, and it includes interviews with hi. Okay, I figured I couldn't be seen because I'm only 5 feet, so I'm a really small person. Okay, I need a stool. Yeah, and so this includes interviews with folks from presses around the country. I do want to say this focuses specifically on university presses, but a lot of this information can be applicable to any organization, including outside of publishing. I do have a literature background, as I imagine many people do, so that's kind of a common thread here as well. And this is work that really emerged because I was at a lot of publishers where we were going around sitting a lot about challenges and threats, which is not really fun, even though it's our reality. And I wanted to try and figure out how we can do things a little bit better. And so that's where this paper came from. Okay, cool. So just a little bit of context, which I think probably most of you know, so I'll try and go through it quickly. So university presses, have always sort of been able to, or historically been able to prize quality over the bottom line, usually because, they're either a department of the university or they're a nonprofit. But starting with the 1970s, we experienced the crisis of the monograph, with libraries having decreasing budgets for monographs, which had historically been the main source of income for university presses. And that really forced presses to sort of rethink about their strategy a little bit. But then other things started to happen. So we've seen more recently declines in the humanities, which is where I think a lot of presses, historically are rooted. And it makes me very sad. So between 2011 and 2014, English as a discipline experienced a 37.5% drop in enrollment, with a market size dropping from $330,952,430 to $206,739,177, which is quite a lot. And as a literature person, makes me cry. We also have seen, obviously, the growth of OER and open access and what that looks like, which is a huge threat for textbooks in particular. And so what two things that I've noticed have sort of emerged as ways to combat this are sort of a growth in textbooks and trade. Textbooks, have first of all, sell much more volume and have a higher margin, typically about 15 to 20%. And, students, especially in first and second year survey courses, are just like a much wider audience than a monograph. And then, trade is a little bit more of a gamble, but allows a little bit more reach if you're trying to sell to a, quote, general reader, which I would kind of argue probably doesn't exist. But, if it does, then that creates sort of more opportunity that way. Okay, so this is still a little bit contextual, but what I think is really important to note here is that, historically, for a lot of presses, we have this kind of frog model, right, where 20% of titles on a list will pay for about the other 80%. And even if you feel like something you published is going to be in that 20%, it's really difficult to predict how well that title might do. So it's just really hard to sort of figure out how your list is going to look. And with monographs in particular being very expensive, usually around like a $95 kind of mark, you've really got to have really high quality content, which I think is something we all know, but I think it bears, sort of reiterating just to merit those higher prices. And because of that, something I heard from a lot of folks I interviewed was just this need to be really like the leading press in a particular field in order to make sure you're having that, truly quality, innovative content. And if, you're not leading the field, then maybe you don't want to be in it because it's not worth it. And that content is really integral to press identity because it is part of symbolic capital. And it's something that your authors will pay attention to when they talk to others and when they're evaluating a press. And the general reader will evaluate too if we believe they're real, which is another question. So this now gets into the heart of this, which is we're going to really talk about how to sort of balance market and mission. And I really love this quote from Stephen Yates, that publishing is barely an industry. It's hardly a business. It's more like art. And the worse you are at the business, the less it can seem like art, which is something that I certainly relate to. And I think perhaps many of us do as well. So to sort of dig into that question, I think a great solution is to sort of examine organizational story and what makes a good organizational story. So, written or oral story in general typically reflects the values of the society from which it originates. And Stephen King famously talks about good writing as telepathy in its purest distillation, which I really like. And so I think a successful story really opens a dialogue between writer and reader, or in the case of an organization, the organization and its stakeholders. And we know from the literature that a strong organizational story includes various positive effects, including sparking actions, communicating who you are, communicating who the company is, transmitting your values, fostering collaboration, sharing knowledge, and leading people into the future. Doesn't that sound positive? So, and so when I say this, and when I say positive storytelling, I want to stress too that this is not to say that a press or a company can't talk about challenges or difficulty that you've had in the past or are currently experiencing, but to rather focus on what's gone well, to celebrate our wins, what we've done well as a team and as a group, and the possibility of the future. And a really important way of doing that is sort of starts from the top and trickles down, which is, authentic leadership, which is a term I think most of us have heard, is really, really key and important. And basically that's someone who is self-aware of their own value, strengths, and limitations, somebody who shows up exactly as they are, no matter the setting, whether it's professional or otherwise. So, I'm talking to you just like I talk to anybody else. That's the goal. And when used appropriately, authentic leadership can build trust and relationships and create organizational integrity and a cultural norm of curiosity. And a really, really important part of this and why it's so difficult for so many of us to step into a place of authenticity is because what really defines and underpins authenticity is vulnerability, which is something that makes us all really, really uncomfortable. And in the literature, vulnerability is defined as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. So who likes those things? Not me. But vulnerability, is the birthplace of creativity and of connection. And connection is, key to this because, just self-awareness and self-concept are, not enough. They have to be acted on. And it's through, this motivational piece of connection and vulnerability that sets authentic leaders apart. These are typically people who don't seek out leadership roles, but rather people who take on leadership as a way of promoting a goal or mission that they care about deeply. And so you can imagine that then is something that they carry forward in all of their decision making for the organization. Okay. So we're going to go over here to strengths and values. So in order to move across to sort of how do we implement this a little bit. I think it's really important for presses of all sizes and all types to think about like what they're really good at and what they value and where they come from, and using that as a basis to kind of move forward and make positive decisions. I have, and this looks, slightly different depending on like, a larger organization obviously has more resources and the smaller one is sort of burdened by constraint, but the concept is the same. And so I have a couple examples. On a larger scale, I had the opportunity to talk to Greg Britton from Johns Hopkins, and he told me about how one of their key tenets of their mission is just, expanding global reach of the research in general, which was part of the decision to pioneer Project Muse. Even though that, at the time could have been a little bit scary, moving into the digital space, intimidating. But, it's given them the opportunity to better analyze their lists, their acquisitions, their branding, and to build these really niche specialized lists, which goes back to, what I was saying earlier around sort of being a leader in a specific field. And so that was a decision that ended up being in line with, those root beliefs. And in terms of a smaller press, I also got to speak to folks at the University Press of Mississippi, which was founded in the 1970s as a consortium of 8 universities, all of which would pay a set contribution to the press's annual costs. And so it was from the beginning this very deliberately cooperative, collaborative place, in part because Mississippi is a small state with scarce resources. And they sort of established from the beginning that they wanted to be able to tell the story of the state and not feel as though they needed a big New York publisher to come in and tell that story for them. So one of the things that they set out to do was to be honest and really reckon with some of the big sort of historical sins of a state like Mississippi. And so they've very deliberately went and tried to build and have built strong lists in Black folklore, the civil rights movement, and African-American literature as ways of exploring, quote, who was left out, who was left behind, and who was lynched, which I think is really important. And since then, they've had folks in those fields come to them very directly, building up a strong comics list and actually a really cool book about Eudora Welty and her photographs, just kind of by understanding and being honest about who they are and where they come from, which is great. So I'll move to my next slide. Okay. So organizational storytelling, as I've sort of alluded to, begins with who we are and what we believe, and the process for translating that into something tangible is framing. So a frame is a mental model, a set of ideas and assumptions that you carry with you in your head to help you understand and negotiate a particular territory. A good frame makes it easier to know what you're up against and ultimately what you can do about it. And managers need to develop and carry accurate maps in their heads. If we sort of take, as I typically do, a little bit of a humanist, a little bit of a literature approach to things, I think we can take the word map and call it a narrative because it's kind of the same thing. And so if we are able to sort of see these problems, these stresses that we've been experiencing, and kind of reframe or retool them into opportunities, then that's a new way to sort of think about, what we've been experiencing. And as an example, I spoke to folks at Princeton University Press, and who at the time was struggling with changes in the disciplines and shrinking enrollments, as I mentioned earlier. And they kind of realized that that was not going to go away. And so what they tried to do then was to integrate sort of emerging fields within lists for disciplines where they are already published, with the broader list, to be a part of that conversation. So they published like graphic design books as that was emerging, and sort of slotted it into the history of art fields, which they already have a very strong list in. And in that way, kind of reinforcing this sort of arts reputation, but also becoming known within this new subdiscipline, and for being kind of innovative and exciting. They also tried to, instead of having this more traditional view of like taking on a particular topic written by a competent authority, which I feel like is the very sort of standard thing that we try to do. They, when looking at trade in particular, they tried to find texts that draw out emotion from readers, as a different way to sort of think about trade. And Schiller's economic trade title, Irrational Exuberance, is a good example of this, because it drew on very real examples or very real questions that the public had surrounding the stability of the stock market in the early 2000s. And they felt that that aligned with their mission of sort of enriching the global conversation. Ooh, okay, so I think I'm good on time. Okay, so the next section we're going to talk about is kind of authorship and ethics, just because we're getting into questions. When we talk about this, we talk about sort of who does this organizational story belong to, and what is it, and how do we all kind of work on it together. Okay, great. So this is a fun one. So we're going to talk a little bit about an organization's soul in the same way that you or I have a soul. And in the literature, soul is defined as a resolute sense of character, a deep confidence about who we are, what we care about, and what we deeply believe in. So I would like to think that soul is simply a manifestation of an organization's most authentic self. And I think that in times of difficulty, that's where we should turn, is towards the organizational soul, to think about, how we want to approach things. And this is, a soul is a collaborative thing that we can work on together. And that sort of giving this opportunity for authorship within the organization provides space for authentic leadership to grow. And that, we can create something that is representative of our core values. And when we do that together, they can be motivating, which can help us all sort of work better and achieve greater things. Okay. So obviously, when a book does really well, it becomes a part itself of a press's sort of bigger organizational story. It may be obvious, but books can't be marketed without author names, and it's very hard to decouple authors from, marketing initiatives, for example. What exists here is a very interdependent relationship where press and author lean on each other in order to be successful. And I think it's worth noting that within that sort of tree, or that team, the acquisitions editor is really important for creating that initial enthusiasm that ripples out to a disciplined team. And, if a book comes out or an author comes out that is really in line with a press's mission, vision, and values in their history, you should embrace them and just take the power and fuel each other. So, Princeton has had a great opportunity to do that with Einstein. The Meaning of Relativity was published in 1922 when the press was less than 20 years old, and that really created a lot of buzz. But since then, the press has published other titles that are not sciencey in that way, but that talk about Einstein as a person and as a humanist. And that really plays into one of Princeton's goals, to sort of create this connection, this dialogue between the arts and the sciences, and sort of nurture cross-disciplinary discourse. Okay. As part of books and authors, we have author care, and how important authors are to ensuring sort of, that organizational story, because they contribute to it. And authors and publishers often seek each other out because brands are mutually enforcing. And, authors obviously talk to each other, and if they hear a bad story, then that's going to impact who they choose to publish with. And so we really need to be taking care of all our authors, even those with lower revenue titles, because each one of them can become really strong advocates for their press within their disciplines if they have a positive experience. A good example here is anybody who's taken a creative writing course probably knows Janet Burroway, who wrote probably the big, for a long time, the leading creative writing textbook, and which was at Pearson for a very long time. And when Pearson was going through some organizational shifts, Janet at AWP, the Association of Writers and Writing Programs, was very vocal about not having a great experience. And she was able to move the book to Chicago University Press, where she had a much better experience. She had a team that supported her. They gave her a big event, a launch event at AWP the next time. And she went on to say wonderful things about them, which has been really great and really helpful. And, obviously that's a AAA book. Not every book is going to get that kind of attention. But Cambridge University Press had a smaller author, Jared Rubin, and they were able to do something similar digitally, because he obviously was not a AAA book. And the book was Rules, Religion, and Riches, Why the West Got Rich and the Middle East didn't. And so they did a lot of cross-pollination with their social media and his. Whenever a rave review came in, they tagged it for various stakeholders. They had a hashtag, they did webinars, things that are, may seem obvious, but by funneling all of this energy into that author, he then became, loyal to them and was able to promote Cambridge even beyond the book's release. And they created, over 200,000 impressions and 6,414 reach engagements. So, a lot of effort for somebody who may not be the highest on the list. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is partnership, which is why we're all here today. So I just want to stress that, we university presses, and I think publishing in general for a long time, has been sort of living in this world of scarcity. I talked sort of at the opening about challenges and threats, and this idea that, common pool resources are, those that are naturally available without any sort of boundaries, but once somebody takes them, then there's less for everybody else. So, the cookie jar just sort of evaporates as we take more. But I think what actually is more useful is what we're doing here today, which is for people to come together and share what's worked for you, what's been successful. There's, lots of great organizations here, like the Association of University Presses and AAP, and I'm not going to go through the list, but there's, lots of wonderful opportunities for you all to build bonds and share knowledge, both for your own organization, but for the sake of the network. And I think as, publishing encounters, more stress, I think, we're better off surviving together and working together than trying to, beat each other, because then it's just going to become a race, and it's much better if we can all come through the end together. Basically, publishing is a business. We all know this, but it's also an art. It's an art born from soul, specifically the souls of people, like people in this room, who are responsible for creating the material and crafting the narrative. And by refocusing on the values and beliefs that bring people to our press and that started presses doing what they do, kind of regardless of where you fit in the organization or your stakeholder role, we can create spaces for presses to recenter. And in doing so, develop lists and decisions that feel authentic to who these organizations are. And I think that is the best way that we can move forward in times of stress. So that's my piece. And Maliea, do you want to come up here for this last slide? Yeah, come join me. So we're just gonna close with some recommendations.
Mhm.
Do you want to go through yours first?
Sure. Be more transparent with your authors. Talk to them more, especially debut authors. I worked with a debut author when I was at Ooligan, and I was taught by my professors to make sure I was checking in with her at least once a month to keep her updated about the process, what we were doing, what's coming next. And keeping them appraised of the progress made on their work. If we're encountering a problem, I try to like let them know right away. And to prioritize kind of creativity and storytelling. I think that's mostly why we're all in this business in the first place, is to tell stories and prioritize that over the financial gain that may or may not come from a single manuscript.
Yeah. And along with that too, I think, maybe I didn't say this explicitly, but when we talk about sort of positive storytelling and sort of celebrating wins, that makes people more productive. And there actually is research that actually does affect financial gain and affects the bottom line. So this is not just, to make it like a happy workplace, like it does actually affect the money as well in a positive way. But yes, I think it would be great if more of us could remain true to our core mission and vision and values. And remember that our authors can be our very best advocates, and therefore we should treat them well and encourage them to do so, and to do more of what you're doing here today. So just connect with each other, both individually, but also on an organizational level, and to share what y'all are doing, because that I think is how we'll survive together. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you.
Stay there and we'll take questions, and I have to.
Yeah,
do the
sure.
volume thing. No, you're just
Okay.
taking. I have to. Yeah, the manual volume.
Okay. I will. Yeah.
I can stand by.
Yeah. You stand.
I'll be visible.
Yeah. Nobody can see me. It's fine.
Hi.
Here.
While we're waiting on some questions to emerge in the room and also online, again, for those of you online, please use the interact button so that we can intercept and receive your questions. So when John and I put the conference together, we look for really sensible pairings and also inspiring pairings. And this one is called Ways and Means, which was sort of the second title, because I wanted, as I think, benefit for students in the program, as well as folks who are here to deepen their knowledge in their career, to connect with one another, is to really understand like how publishing even comes into being, right? Before we can talk about AI affecting things or changing workflows or making things more equitable or transparent, like how do we get there? It's really hard to do without an author contract and to understand the complexities of that. It's really hard to do without knowing the objectives of your institution. And so originally this was like a how the sausage gets made presentation, but I called it Ways and Means because that's a bit more diplomatic. And so I just wanted to thank you both for bringing so much clarity and energy into parts of the process that a lot of us, especially if we've been in the industry for a while, take for granted that we understand or have some knowledge about, and making it accessible and transparent for students. I know with one of my students who's actually here, he had some questions about a contract. And as a rights manager, my answer to everything is, well, it depends. It depends on what your objectives and priorities are as a publisher, because your contract ideally will reflect that. So I just wanted to offer some appreciation for what you shared and how you shared it, because it brings a lot of clarity to questions that people might assume others understand, but aren't always made obvious. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And if anyone here has questions, the tiny mic is ready.
This is going to be kind of challenging to ask, but both of you did do a fantastic job, as Pooja was saying, of wrapping in together some really core concepts. And I lived through like years of trauma just thinking about all the author dissatisfaction in your presentations. Because I'm in marketing, you can never have a totally happy author, especially with a debut author, as you call them generously. They always want to make their debut. I always say it takes, 9 months to have a baby and then it's born. Well, I mean, these books can take longer than that.
Oh yeah.
And they think it's like more important than a child sometimes. So with all of that said, and trying to put the trauma behind me, one question that I thought I could frame was, in the context of good faith and in the context of a university press trying to expand its success and publish in domains that maybe outside the normal monograph approach that they would have taken, and they maybe are going to dip into this thing that they believe they can find that elusive general reader, as you well stated. What is the responsibility of the publisher to have the marketing infrastructure to support that? I put it to both of you.
Yeah, do you
And what does that
I'll
look
do-
like? Just curious from your perspective.
Okay. I mean, I want to borrow it depends, but yeah, no, I think it does depend slightly on like a case by case basis because of or I'll get close to the mic, sorry. I just like eye contact. Because this is why I kind of threw out different examples between like, okay, like this is a AAA title and this is not, because I think obviously, budget and resources dependent, like it will look differently. But I think the main thing is if you're going into a new space, whatever it is, I think you have to have a reason for doing it and like reasonable belief that you're the right person to do it, because it falls in line with, again, those sort of press values, right? And in terms of like more practically how to sort of launch it, I think, I think if you have like a great author who's really willing to be engaged, that's always your best scenario, having been a marketer myself. And any ways that you can leverage their ability to help you, whether that is, something in person, whether that's something online or whatnot. And then I think, we live in this virtual world now. So however, you can kind of connect with the discipline. I found Twitter or X, whatever we want to call it, to be a really, really great place for academics. And so that's like the easiest place for me to like engage with the discipline and see what's going on. But I'm very old school. I love just being on campus and calling on campus and talking to instructors and getting a sense of like what's going on in their courses, whether that is for like an acquisitions purpose or whether that's to figure out, how the book is being received, or if we can maybe partner with a local school, if it's, relevant in some way. I think there's lots of different ways that this configuration can work. I think just as long as it makes sense, that for that press to be launching that title, that's what you've got to remember, no matter what the actual process looks like.
I would say in my experience, I was at a teaching press. We had no budget. So we had to be very upfront with authors about what our resources were, what kind of reach we were capable of having. So when I was working on a fantasy novel, it was a very collaborative experience. We were going back and forth with different ideas of different marketing techniques of what we could do feasibly in terms of like social media and things like that. So I think overall, from what I've seen, it's very much a kind of upfront, honest is the best policy type of idea.
Yeah, I want to add to that too. I think the transparency is really important, and it's important too because that like creates trust, right? Like if you're able to tell a author upfront, like, hey, I don't think we're going to be able to do this thing I'm doing for this big AAA book, but we could do this other thing. I'd love your help. Then they're going to trust you more and trust the press more, because you're opening up to them, right? And that's that vulnerability coming through again, and that's really, really important. So good point.
All right, I have a question. So for Maliea mostly, but Sophia as well. When you were doing your research on the satisfaction clause, did you find any parallels, or did you do any research on morality clauses? Do you see any parallels between those? And then for Sophia, I know you were looking at storytelling and organizations, but But did you see in university presses, did you see any uses of morality clauses or anything like that? Maybe that was beyond what you were
I
researching.
wasn't really involved in contracts.
Okay.
Thankfully, it's one department I've escaped. So it's your answer.
Okay, great. I think I may have seen like a passing mention of it once or twice, but I did not really get that far into like figuring out what they were and what the parallels were between them. So it was not a huge thing with the stuff I was reading.
Next year then.
Yeah.
It's your next topic.
Yeah. Part two.
Other questions?
Okay. I still have right.
Mine just keeps going.
Oh, thank you.
Hi,
Hello.
I have a sausage making question.
Oh,
Yeah,
boy.
go for it.
So my organizations, we don't publish peer reviewed work, but most of our writing was done in-house. And we've really started leaning outside. And we need to come up with some sort of an author care packet. And, we're thinking of things like templates and organizational history and contacts, that sort of thing. Can you recommend anybody in the publishing industry that you've seen that has a really nice author packet that we could emulate?
Ooh,
That's a you question.
that's a me question.
You were more specific.
Yeah, I've seen a couple different versions of it. It's tough when you're small, but I think the more you can customize it, the better. Because I think people know when something is templatized. And this, I'm not saying don't templatize it. I'm just saying like you have a template, but then make sure you go in and adjust it like accordingly. And this goes back to the earlier question too. I would be upfront about what they realistically can and cannot expect, to be clear. I'm trying to think if I've seen a really good one. I would have to think on that. Specifically, I feel like probably, are you a university press or?
No, I'm with the United States Pharmacopoeia.
Okay, okay.
Kind of, we're sort of different, sort of organization.
It is a
A lot of tailoring is gonna go into it.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, when I say word templates, I mean that we want to provide them with templates to do their writing in, because our text is very formatted.
I see.
And that will actually cut down on a lot of work on those sides. So yeah, I've been looking around to see who's got a packet that just says, hey, you're a new author, here you go, this is what we are, what we accept.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Just to add as a
No, you go
resource,
ahead.
and this is without any endorsement, this is a university press that I actually haven't worked for, but the University of North Carolina Press has, they have their own author portal, but on their website, they have a really nice step-by-step sort of what is publishing and what is happening to my work. And it includes an explanation, I'm looking at it now, of acquisitions, copy editing, production, marketing, general admin, and then it gives authors access to this portal where I'm sure there's more information. I don't have access to it. That's just one example that I share with my students in terms of how do I explain why they can't start bugging the marketing manager when they just submitted their
True.
manuscript, and how to set reasonable expectations
Yeah.
on what the contributions are from both sides and how that partnership can be really flourishing. So that's one example, UNC Press. I'm sure there are
Totally.
others. Cambridge, do they have a good authors?
Cambridge does want to remember it.
Yeah.
If I think of more, I will let you know. The one thing I would add on is just, I think you can't go too basic. Like don't assume that people know what all of these things are, because they don't. And if they do, they can just skip over it and, save themselves 20 minutes.
I have a question from the friends.
Okay. Yeah, I think I turned that down.
Oh.
See.
We've got one question coming in from our online attendees. saying it's interesting to hear mention of engagement on Twitter. I'm just going to say Twitter and not X. Twitter was great for engaging with the wider community, but as a publisher, we've seen significant decrease in Twitter engagement. Have you
Yeah.
seen a similar drop?
I
And how
have.
is your strategy changing, if at all?
I have. At Princeton, we tried to move over to Mastodon because we saw people were going over there, but I feel like it hasn't picked up quite as much as perhaps it will in the future. I don't know. So I think it's an evolving situation, and we're kind of just watching to see what's going to be the next big thing. I don't think the world knows what the next big thing is going to be. So I think it's keeping an eye on Twitter. I think it's keeping an eye on, Mastodon and similar things. And we're just kind of figuring it out as it evolves.
Shameless plug for Jen Regala, also SSP Marcom committee chair. She is a passion for social media channels. She is trying to convince AUA to go with a TikTok channel. I don't think she's gotten there yet.
Yeah.
But I believe in the future, if we think about the cohort of students graduating now, it's got to be video, right? But what does video look like in the future, and how do they use it? I don't know that we know, but I think I would just say we're all on the same boat of trying out everything, seeing which communities follow what. I mean, Black Twitter and the TikTok book club were phenomenal opportunities for publishers in certain domains. And I think we need to keep trying to build those communities and encourage people as they grow. So, but right now I'm living in LinkedIn.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that's a marketer's life, right? Is the way we marketed a year ago is not the way we market today. So it's a constant checking in on things. Absolutely. So thank you for that.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Annie, again, a graduate at GW.
Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Oh, awesome. Nice. My question was about author support after publication. I know you did a little bit with that, Sophia, but I was wondering, especially with scholarly publications dealing with history and social issues, we've been seeing a lot of book bans happening out in the world, especially with public libraries. And there are reports of some groups specifically targeting bookstores. So I know that's not quite the university press demographic, but there have been protests over university press published monographs and other books. So I was wondering if you all had any insight for author support on that direction.
This is also an evolving topic. No, I think that's a very astute question. Very current. I think that, we're kind of figuring it out as it goes on and trying to figure out how we want to support authors. I think the most important thing is that regardless, authors feel supported by the press, so that we have, continued communication with them about what's going on, and can try, to engage with them. Maybe we could have an event or something talking about, the book, and maybe even in relation to the ban. I'm not sure. Politically, there's not very much we can do. It's kind of out of our control. But I think just any way to make sure that they feel like we're there with them and they're not alone. That's the goal. And if they have any questions, to try and listen to those, take those on board. So I think that's also kind of an evolving thing, unfortunately, and we'll just keep an eye on it.
Or letting them know what you're doing in the times, if they get banned, what you as a press are doing to support them, or maybe doing in the local community to try and work with them.
I think also any language, I think sometimes authors are also very unsure when something is kind of beyond their reach of how to discuss it, especially if they are somebody maybe a little bit burgeoning in success, right? So they haven't had to deal with something quite like that, or attention in that way, right? Media attention. So I think if something like that comes up, I think being able to give them some language about what the press is doing, how we're supporting them, and even just the situation more broadly, that's helpful. So that they at least have some direction and they don't get in, a situation, whether it's on Twitter or anywhere else, where they don't feel comfortable talking about what's going on.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So thanks again to Maliea and Sophia. Maliea came all the way from Idaho to present in person, which is amazing. And Sophia came down from Princeton, which we appreciate.